Okay, just so for folks who who is the first time on this call, this is a weekly and reading group call that we have on causal machine learning papers. And I'm presenting today, but it's not usually me. It's the first time I'm presenting in a, well, it's the first time I'm presenting. And so we have a Google Doc floating around somewhere of the actual papers that we're kind of running through. Some of them are, so like recently we went through a whole bunch of identification algorithm ones, which kind of assumed that you knew a little bit about causal inference. Some of them are a bit more lightweight. This one I would say is more on the lightweight side, is coming from computational psychology. You know, in the course, in the workshop, there's, you know, focused a lot on probabilistic programming. A lot of that probabilistic programming tech came out of the CogSci community because, well, I'm not sure why that happened, but like the goal of CogSci is to, of computational CogSci is to kind of reason about how humans understand things, understand the world, understand a process, understand how they learn, how they make judgments, for example. And the way to do that is to reverse engineer them by, you know, coming up with computational models about how those processes work, which is really fun because if our goal here is to, you know, do machine learning and do artificial intelligence, then engineering algorithms that can reason, that mimic the way that humans reason is, you know, that's kind of, you know, if we do that successfully, then we're doing artificial intelligence, right? And so, and this is a paper that is focused on how we might do this for causal modeling or causal discovery. And so let me just share my screen. So our previous papers were kind of, a few of them were kind of dense. This is less dense, but I think it's super interesting.
Sorry, Robert, can I ask a question about the Google? Somebody's put the Google Doc for one of the previous papers, and it looks super good, but it's just the one. Is there like a higher level directory that we can get access to with presentations from previous papers? Because this is my first time.
Yeah, we should have been recording those presentations. I don't think we did that. Let's do that going forward. I think now, so I'm recording now, and so this should get beamed up to TWIML. So this will, I think going forward, now that we kind of formalized this, we'll start having, I'll share these notes, and then we'll start maybe saving the results from previous readings. That would be a good idea.
Thanks, Robert.
Can you see my screen? Am I sharing? Yeah. All right. All right, so this paper introduces this idea of an intuitive theory. So we're calling this a cognitive structure, analogous to a scientific theory. Intuitive theories are important in how we organize basic knowledge about the world, and they're key for learning causal knowledge within the domain. And so basically they'll help you generate causal relationship hypotheses and understand which variables are informative about those hypotheses. But they also constrain the space of hypotheses that you're able to generate. And again, we're not just talking about summarizing the information, you know, summarizing the relationships in the domain. We're talking about something that's generative, something that's computable. So in the paper, they say theory-like representations are not just a convenient way of summarizing certain aspects of human knowledge. They provide crucial foundations for successful learning and reasoning, and we want to understand how they do so. So in other words, we want more than a tool for summarizing knowledge. We want a tool that we can reason with algorithmically. The key questions the authors are asking here is, you know, what is the content of intuitive theories? How do intuitive theories guide the acquisition of new causal knowledge? And how are intuitive theories acquired? So again, the reason we're kind of going into this comp sci space is that, we're in this reading group and in the workshop, we're very interested in linking causal inference and artificial intelligence. So, they specifically say, like, we're trying to reverse engineer human causal reasoning processes. So, like, they gave some examples. So a medic arrives at a trauma scene and they have to make some snap judgments about what's wrong with the victim after seeing just a few suspicious symptoms, and there's no time to do exhaustive testing. Similarly, a child may discover a new causal relationship given only a few observations of a novel system, even in the presence of hidden variables or complex dynamics. And so the question becomes, like, all right, well, how is it that humans here are able to infer these causal relationships or these causal mechanisms with very little sparse data with lots of latent or hidden variables? And if we can figure out how we can do this, then we're getting closer to some good AI. And this is, I want to emphasize, like, how different this is from the standard causal inference literature, which is very concerned about identification and correctness. So identification, it means in terms of the ability to identify the correct causal model from data, or the correct the ability to estimate the causal thing that you're trying to estimate from data. We're not trying to be correct here. We're trying to emulate the human reasoning process. And even though that process may be biased, we're assuming that there's some kind of implicit biases in that system that allow us to do a lot with nothing. And so the kind of theory posited by this paper is that there's this thing called an intuitive theory that provide a framework for humans to make these inferences from very sparse data. And so the paper, and what I'm focusing on in these slides, is really just the analogy to linguistics. So here on the right hand, I have a kind of a grammatical parse tree of an utterance. So John hit the ball, and then that thing above it is a parse tree. Parse trees also exist in, say, for example, any kind of symbolic notation. So in math, for example, or in a programming language, you can also get parse trees. But what we're making, the first thing to make clear is that the thing that we just talked about in the workshop, for example, that we usually use to represent causality, these causal dags, that's not sufficient to capture the level of representation that we're trying to capture. And the converse is that the causal grammars that we're going to come up with, the intuitive theories that we're going to come up with, can generate a causal dag. And so, these are hierarchical, higher order theories that generate lower order theories, and at the bottom of that hierarchy are the causal dag. And this is very similar to how in, say, a grammar, you start with some very high level rules up top, and then at the end you forward generate several layers down, you get to an actual, say, utterance, or rather a parse tree. So here the causal dag is analogous to a parse tree. And so, so the first question is, like, why not? Why can't a causal dag represent these intuitive theories? So dags are constructed based on rules, but they can't represent the rules themselves. So intuitive theories emphasize the importance of abstract concepts and causal laws, not just the specific variables and the causal relationships between them. So these concepts and laws govern how we could construct the causal explanations, for example, a dag. So if we're using a dag to represent a causal explanation, those concepts or laws would tell you, okay, what are the space of dags that we can generate? But you can't really go the other way. So when I studied this stuff during my PhD, I focused a lot on systems biology. This is a causal dag representing a signaling pathway in cells. All these the PKC, PKA, these are all phosphoproteins inside of a cell, for example. And those edges are causal relationships. But what are the nature of the causal relationships of proteins, right? Well, the nature of that relationship comes from this set of theory called enzyme kinetics that talk about how, say, protein, those signaling protein interactions happen. So in this case, that notation down there says an enzyme and a substrate come together, they bind together into a compound, and then that enzyme catalyzes a reaction on that substrate that causes it to become a phosphoprotein. In other words, become kind of enzymatically active within the system. So you don't have to understand what any of that means. It just means that, like, in order for me to draw these edges, I needed to have this biochemical understanding of what the edge even entails in terms of mechanism. That was my interpretation of it. If anybody else read the paper, they think I'm off.
I have a slightly different interpretation, which is that they talk about in like biology, they have like, these behaviors which lead to diseases, and the diseases create symptoms, right? So there are different classes of objects, and you can only draw an arrow between one class of objects and another class of objects, and you never see a symptom leading to a symptom or a behavior leading to a behavior. You always see behaviors. You never see symptoms leading to diseases. Is always the other way around, right?
Yeah. So that was, although this is the example that he's talking about next. Although I think he says there that those rules that we're going to discuss here, they don't actually constitute an intuitive theory, but rather they're an example of things that aren't represented explicitly in the graph structure that you would like to have some kind of explicit representation of. It's like a missing abstraction.
Right, exactly. So the nodes have like different classes. They come from different classes, and there are different edge types, right? Right.
So here we're saying, so what is we have a nice causal DAG, and so what's wrong with this? Why can't it represent these things? What is it that's missing that we want to represent? So here we have this graph where we have some, smoking causes lung cancer and bronchitis. High-fat diet causes heart disease. We have flu causing symptoms like coughing, chest pain, and fever. Lung cancer also causing coughing and chest pain. And so great, we have this great representation of causality. What's missing? And the answer is, well, we can see here that we have different classes of variables. So up top, we have smoking, high-fat diet, stressful lifestyle, working in a factory. These are all lifestyles or behaviors, right? On a second level here, we have lung cancer, bronchitis, flu, heart disease. These are all diseases. And then the third level, we have symptoms, right? And then there's we might have some rules for how these different levels interact. So these colors here correspond to different classes of nodes. And again, these classes there's nothing in the DAG structure itself that explicitly captures these classes. And so that's a missing abstraction. Similarly, in this graph 1, we see that we might look at this and make some inference like, oh, okay, so behaviors are able to cause the disease, and diseases cause the symptoms, right? So those are rules that we've imposed, that we might suppose are imposed on this system here. So in the graph, so graph 6 here, we still have those three classes, but that rule that behaviors cause disease cause symptoms is not holding here, right? But but from a DAG specification, there's nothing in the specification of the DAG that captures that difference, right? These are just two DAGs on the same system here, right? There's nothing about the behaviors can cause disease can cause symptoms, rules that show up in the specification of the DAG. So this is
actually graph 6 is a cyclic graph, so that would be a constraint.
Yeah, I was just looking about that. Graph 6 is a cyclic graph.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that they shouldn't have done that. It just makes it confusing.
Yeah, kind of like messed up.
I mean, they would have, you know, if they just had this edge going from working in a factory causes a headache, that would have been sufficient to make the point. Kind of coughing causing smoking just makes everybody confused. All right, so then they talk about this. So I think there's maybe some people on the call maybe more familiar with this body of literature than I am. They talk about framework theories and specific theories. So this is new to me. So a specific theory is a detailed, so these are ideas from CogSci, I guess, or from philosophy of science, because they cite people like Kuhn and stuff like that. But they say a specific theory is a detailed mechanistic formulation about a specific set of phenomenon. While a framework theory describes a set of phenomenon that are in its domain with an ontology. So it outlines abstract principles, concepts, and terms that hold across all the phenomena in that domain. It has basic causal laws and other explanatory mechanisms behind the phenomena. And it gives you a formal language for generating hypotheses about a specific theory. So specific theories come from framework theories, and the framework theories only really connect with raw evidence, with raw data through a specific theory. So we have to kind of work through a specific theory to kind of get evidence or to reason probabilistically about our framework theory. So he draws an analogy to, so this, most of the bulk of this paper is to, when I wrote this up, I just kind of focused on the computational linguistics element. After this, they talk a lot about, a little bit about the causal semantics, a lot about kind of Bayesian inference, which I think is kind of, for people on this call, would be old hat. So I'm focusing most of this conversation on the linguistics part, because that analogy between causal modeling and kind of Chomsky style generative linguistics is what's interesting to me, really. But if anybody read the paper and wants to talk more about some of the other elements of the paper, I'm happy to let you take the reins. So anyway, in the analogy to generative grammars and linguistics, Chomsky on analogy between theories and grammars. So this is Chomsky speaking in his book on three models for the description of language. Any scientific theory is based on a certain finite set of observations, and by establishing general laws stated in terms of certain hypothetical constructs, it attempts to account for these observations, to show how they are interrelated, and to predict an indefinite number of new phenomena. Similarly, so he's described what a scientific theory is, and now he's going to analogize this with a grammar. Similarly, a grammar is based on a finite number of observed sentences, and it projects this set to an infinite set of grammatical sentences by establishing general laws framed in terms of phonemes, words, phrases, and so on. So this is the main connection, that we're going from a scientific theory, we're analogizing between scientific theory and how it can explain phenomena to a grammar and how it can explain utterances. So he gives some authors give some examples of some parses, of some utterances. So we have two languages here. So in language A, we got cat, so some utterances: cats eat fish, dogs eat bones, dogs like people. In the other language, we have cats eat dogs, bones eat dogs, fish like people. So these two languages have the same syntax as subject, verb, object. And so thus they have the same parses. And so we would think that these two speakers are speaking the same language, but based on what they're actually saying, we would reason that they have different beliefs or rules about the objects they're talking about. So this is similar to the case where we have, this is basically, he's analogizing it to this case, right? Where we have two dags, and we're talking about the same things, and we're talking about relationships, the same type of relationships between these things, but we have different beliefs about what can cause what. Here we have different beliefs about the relationship between the subjects and the objects in these sentences, but it's the same kind of language. This contrasts with this example where, so we have cats eat fish, dogs like people. Here we have cat, on the language tree, we have cats, fish eat, dogs bones eat, dogs people like. And so now we have different syntax. We have, so on the left, we have a subject verb object syntax, while on the right, we have a subject object verb syntax, similar to what you would see in Korean or Japanese or Turkish. So we see now we have people speaking different languages, but they have a consistent set of beliefs or rules. And I think they describe 4 levels of hierarchy. So theories of generative grammar posit at least 4 levels of structure to knowledge of language. Each higher level of abstraction generates the structures at the level below. And so in so doing, higher levels of abstraction can constrain the lower levels of abstraction. And then we have kind of 2 inference processes, or two tasks here that we're interested in reasoning about. So language comprehension and language learning, or more specifically grammar learning. So these are processes of inductive inference defined in terms of this hierarchy. So let me see if that's, so what we're saying here is that, like, there's 2 things we want to do. We want to understand an utterance, and we want to, or we're a child, so you're speaking to me and I want to understand what you're saying. The other example is, I'm a child trying to learn, I'm an infant trying to learn language, right? And so based on a lot of examples of utterances, I'm trying to infer a grammar so that I can reproduce utterances that are consistent with what I've heard so far. And those 2 tasks are going to be defined in terms of this 4-level hierarchy here. So going from this top level, so that UG means universal grammar, going down to syntactic categories and rules. This goes down to syntactic structures. And then the lowest element here being utterances. So the syntactic categories and rules comes as analogous to framework theory. These are the general frameworks, the ontologies, the description of the mechanisms, the terms, the abstractions that connect everything within a specific domain. And then the syntactic structures, that relates to a specific theory.
Robert, can we go back and look at the DAG again and just talk about how these, are we saying that the frameworks map to these levels or no?
We're saying this is an example of the lack of expressivity of a DAG, right? So like if I just, in other words, they say like,
I guess my question is, are we saying that that any of these are a framework theory or no?
No, we're not saying
They're a
that.
specific theory.
Yeah, I mean, so they haven't, so what they're doing, all they're doing right now is just, is explaining the problem. So if we just look at these 2 DAGs, we see, oh yeah, I mean, so putting aside, let me just, because it's kind of an eyesore, isn't it? Let's see if I can't block out this annoying edge here that just makes us wonder about cycles. But putting aside that annoying edge here, what we have here is 2 valid directed graphs on the same set of variables, right? And so the only thing that's different between these 2 things are the set of edges, which means that they're basically two possible causal hypotheses for explaining the relationships between the variables in the system. What this DAG, so we can stare at this and be like, oh wait, I know, like just by looking at this, I can see like, smoking, high fat diet, stressful lifestyle, working in a factory. These are things that people do, right? Lung cancer, flu, bronchitis, heart disease. These are diseases. Coughing, chest pain, headache, fever. These are symptoms, but I'm imposing that on this DAG. DAG doesn't tell me that directly. I'm just using my domain knowledge to reason about this and say like, oh, okay, these are groups of things. And so similarly, if I squint a little bit harder, I can see like, I see like behavior causes disease. This is assuming there's something here that's saying that behavior causes diseases and diseases causes symptoms. Well, that is certainly not. So here we have a disease causing another disease. Here we have a behavior causing a symptom, right? So this is, there's more rigid set of assumptions going into this DAG than in that DAG. Those assumptions are not clearly explicitly represented anywhere in the DAG structure. And so that's why they're saying like, whatever, you know, those things, these rules here, or the lack thereof, these categories here, there needs to be some kind of explicit representation of those things. And so, you know, this is not saying like, we're not saying like, okay, here's a rule and here's some categories and that's an intuitive theory. It's just saying that like, we need some formalization of these things that are not made explicit in the DAG structure.
I guess my point was more that some of these things are already an abstraction, whereas more of these things are things. It's the difference between ideas versus things.
What do you mean by things?
So like a cough, right, is more than an abstraction. Whereas, for example, bronchitis maybe isn't, or let's take heart disease, right? Heart disease is an abstraction that comes with an ontology and maybe lab results, and it's a whole bunch of things that we sort of put a framework around.
Yeah, I think, and so to your point, like stressful lifestyle is
Right.
much more abstract than heart disease.
Right. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that sometimes we impose a model or a framework upon something that isn't a real thing, right?
Yes.
We've completely created it. And then that structures how we think about it and how we reason about it.
And I think that's why this is so cool, because so Chomsky, I think, maybe people in the car are more familiar with Chomsky's work than I am. I think he assumes that like if we get to this higher level here, he calls it a universal grammar. I'm pretty sure it's Chomsky who believes that there's an innate grammar that we're born with. And my understanding of this comes completely from like Neil Stephenson novels. So I'm not sure to what degree of rigor I could talk about that. But like, in this case, but you're at this as we go up the hierarchy here, I think you bring out an interesting point, which is like coughing to some extent, it's a defined thing, but it's a lot more real than heart disease, which is like a confluence of biological things happening. And then, stressful lifestyle is, this is even more abstract, is talking about culture and human experience and stuff like that. And so like, but yeah, like to your point, like not only do we have different categories of things, but these different categories of things have differing levels of abstraction. And that abstraction, the ontology for that abstraction is not captured anywhere in the DAG.
I think when we get into ontology, we need to be very careful that the ontology is actually representing reality as opposed to some perspective of reality, right?
Well, yeah,
a lot of the time, that's all it is. is this a curated perspective of the things?
And I think that's why, I mean, I don't know if there's a true ontology, right? Like if, it's, you know, a lot, you know, recently kind of arguing a bit with people on Twitter about like, you know, scientific objectivism, and how like, you know, and how, so, you know, one thing that we have to understand about kind of epistemology is that there is no view from nowhere, right? We know this in machine learning, like there is no kind of objective inference. There's always assumptions that need to be made for inference to even happen. We need to define the variables. We need to characterize the data generating process, and there's all decisions that are subjective that are going into it. And these authors are even making the point that like if we don't have a rigidly enough defined ontology, or rather a hierarchy in this sense here, that those inferences aren't even possible. And this is something that we kind of know from like philosophy, right? Like I think we talked before about in this group about Goodman's riddle, where like you know, the deductive conclusions you are making defined in where you can come up with consistent you can come up with different definitions of abstractions that could all explain the past data in a certain way, but would all predict future would all make different deductions on future data, about future data, just based completely on how you define the language. Yeah, so like I think particularly in the modeling domain, I mean, you know, if Chomsky's right when it comes to language, there's some kind of ground truth, basic high level language inside all of our brains. But in terms of when it comes down to syntax and syntactic structures, then there's a lot less, there's more variation, less certainty, more uncertainty there. And yeah, to your point, like, I think what this shows is like if we're talking about causal reasoning, then the causal models we come up with, and as a consequence, the conclusions about causality we come up with define entirely on how we define the high level abstraction that we use to constrain our space of causal models. So going back to this, we talk about two kinds of inference tasks in terms of language. So from utterances, so the first thing we want to do is just understand what somebody is saying. So this is just comprehension. So this is characterized in terms of coming up with a parse. So parse being something that looks like this. And so here we look at the utterance, something that somebody says, and we want to infer a syntactic structure, in other words, a parse. And the problem is that so here, like in a probabilistic context-free grammar, so probabilistic in a sense that like, this is not deterministic, so that these rules can come up with a whole bunch of different structures, you know, and some structures having more probability than other ones. And then these structures can come up with a bunch of different utterances, some utterances having more probability than others. Context-free means that we're not, you know, that we're ignoring for a second the fact that most language depends on context. Like the interpretation of a word depends on the words around it. Putting that aside for now, it's like in this kind of simple PCFG scenario, every time we kind of go down a level here, we have a bigger space of things that are possible. And so when we observe something at the bottom level, it means, so we're trying to understand something, it means there's a whole bunch of syntactic structures that are consistent with what we observed. And so we need to kind of pick, and the task of comprehending is to pick the comprehension that has the highest likelihood, or in other words, that's the one that has the highest probability of generating the utterance. The second task is acquiring a grammar. So this is an infant or a language learner learning a new language from a whole bunch of utterances. And so, you know, we're trying to come up with these syntactic categories and rules, yeah, I think, yeah. So we're trying to come up with basically a framework based on a corpus of utterances, but you know, this is a very unconstrained problem. And so in general, there's a whole bunch of possible categories and rules that could come up with a set of utterances. And so what we're hoping this hierarchy can do for us, second. Yeah, what we're hoping this hierarchy can do for us is by having this hierarchy imply, you know, each up higher level imposes constraints on the lower level that make the inference task more feasible. And so we're going to, and basically the argument the paper is making is to, second. Is to, we're going to try to analogize this in terms of to causal modeling. So, you know, we start with, how do I show my, anyway, we start with, you know, we observe some events, we try and come up with some causal structures, but those causal structures would be as causal networks, so causal dags, but those would be kind of constrained by a set of categories and laws, similar to the dags we saw before, but you know, much we're making that. Hopefully, they're going to show us how this could be done formally. You know, which and then at the higher level we have a universal theory. So at the top level we have this universal grammar, like this innate knowledge that every child brings to the task of language acquisition. So in thinking about this, I don't know if people agree with me. Like, so in machine learning, we talk a lot about implicit bias. So say, for example, if we're looking at deep learning, we'll say like, okay, here's an architecture that works really well for this problem. And well, I want to ask myself like, all right, why does it work so well? What is it? Is there some kind of bias about the problem that makes learning easier here? And say, for example, you know, convolutional neural networks are, the implicit bias there is that there's a, is it like a transposition, is that the word, invariance? Right, like if I just, if I shift the image a little bit to the right, that my inferences about the image are not going to change.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so like, similarly, like attention networks have a certain, or transformer networks have a certain implicit bias. You know, there's implicit biases and kind of, I've heard talk of implicit biases, for example, how if you show a kid a picture of a cat, you know, they make the implicit bias that you're talking about one example, the lowest level of example from a category, so that you know, you're not, you know, the kid doesn't assume that, you know, any animal, that a cat refers to all animals. They assume that the cat refers to, you're telling them a specific subcategory of animal called a cat. They assume that like they're not going to assume that everything that's small and has a fuzzy tail is a cat. They assume that like, no, this whole entire thing that's shaped like this, so there's a shape bias there, is a cat. When you show them a cat and they see that it's like an orange tabby cat, they don't make the assumption that all orange things are now called cats. They assume that, again, no, that's just that if I saw another cat, or at least maybe a few more examples, they might say that, okay, this color thing has nothing to do with catness. Well, maybe for a skunk, they might say something differently, right? So those kinds of biases, I've always, when I think about machine learning and architecture, especially neural network architectures, I think about like, all right, how can I understand this architecture in terms of what implicit biases they're encoding? And I've been thinking about this, and again, people feel free to disagree. I think that this universal grammar idea as a kind of implicit bias for how linguistic grammars work. And so like, if otherwise, like given some utterances, if I were going to try and learn a language and there was absolutely no constraints on all the possible grammars of languages that I could learn, it'd be an impossible learning task, it'd be a possible inference task. So I think what Chomsky's suggesting here is that the only way humans are able to kind of acquire language is if there's some constraints on the set of grammars that could generate that language. And so, and that we're kind of evolutionarily attuned to knowing what they are, and then kind of making inferences about the relationship between words that would lead us to successful outcomes in terms of language learning. That's just how I understood it. I don't know if anybody else agrees or disagrees with that. I imagine there are people on the call who are way more familiar with this body of literature than I am.
So are we talking about patterns over here? We are kind of seeing patterns emerge. Is that the implicit bias that you try to refer to? I'm still trying to understand the concept here.
Has anybody else heard of implicit biases in the machine learning conversations before? So yeah, I mean, just like, so the way I read it is like, so the term implicit bias. So yeah, I guess I should have explained this. So in deep learning, so okay, let me explain my understanding of implicit bias without deep learning, explain what I think it means in terms of deep learning, and then if somebody else disagrees or agrees with this, I'd love to hear about it. So implicit bias is when we start talking about how usually the example is a child. And the question is like, all right, how are kids so good at like one-shot learning or few-shot learning? And given some data, there's a whole bunch of conclusions you can draw from it. And so the idea is that, well, if kids are able to like learn from only a few examples while our deep learning algorithms need millions of examples, it must be because kids have biases that are kind of innate in their learning process. They tend to favor some conclusions over other ones. And so with the cat example, I said, like, if I just, some naive algorithm, I said, here's a picture of a cat, and then I show it something that's roughly the same color, or something that's roughly the same shape, or something that has a tail, or something the algorithm has no way of figuring out what it is from just a few examples, what it is that I think that the oracle means when they're saying cat here, right? But you show a kid a cat, not only could they figure out with one or two examples, or two or three, whatever, just a few examples of a cat. Not only can they recognize new cats, but if you draw a picture of a cat, like using some character, some cartoon image of a cat, they'll say that's a cat. If you took like some shears and cut a hedge into the shape of a cat, they would say that's a cat, right? If you gave them a cat lollipop, they would say, oh, look, a cat lollipop. And so not only are they able to recognize cats, but they're able to take even more abstract representations of a cat and recognize it as a cat. And so there's something there, while an algorithm would have a lot of trouble doing that, even with many examples. And so, especially, so if you, for example, trained an algorithm on just, you'll take, if you gave it a bunch of images of a cat, after a while, it would figure out kind of it would be able to categorize cat images. But if you showed it a picture of a cartoon cat drawn on the side of a balloon, or you showed it a picture of Tom from Tom and Jerry, it would probably fail. And so that word implicit bias means like there's some kind of bias towards reasoning or bias towards inference that a kid has, it is using to kind of not only figure out what a cat is, but figure it out from a few examples. And so in this case, I'm trying to, so I really learned about implicit biases from computer vision examples. And so in reading this, I've been thinking about it in terms of natural language. And like, okay, so Chomsky's talking about this universal grammar, which is to say that like we're born with some kind of very specific prior on possible languages. And so if, you know, or at least for possibly human languages. And so it would be, let's imagine that there was some kind of, some, you know, extraterrestrials came and, you know, set up a colony in Antarctica or something like that. And then you wanted to go over there and learn their language. It would be much more difficult to learn their language because it's coming from a completely different prior than to learn a human language, because all human languages have this kind of common prior. So when you see, say, for example, words associated with each other and reading or listening to many people say things, the inferences you make about the grammatical relationship between those words would be, you would make certain inferences, you'd be more likely to make certain inferences, like, say, for example, subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb, then you would be able to, than you would about certain other possible inferences like subject, 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 verb, 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 object, 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 or something like that, right? And so I think that's what the universal grammars thing here is saying. But again, this is me trying to understand it in terms of things that I already understand.
So if we, so go back to the deep learning, like the convolution net.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. I totally agree. It depends what the child has seen, and make a reasonable inference. So the implicit bias stem from the amount of data that the child has seen before. Like in this case, is our model. And now on the language side, are we going to try to look at as many grammars rules as possible to come up with this universal grammar, or we are suggesting that we are putting a constraint on all these languages to make inference problem simpler?
Yeah.
And if you're going to put if you're going to put constraint on this grammar, I would like to see an example of that, because like natural language is pretty complex. It's stem from like culture and environment, and it evolve over time. And I just don't know how feasible it is to put such general constraint on natural languages.
Right. So a few answers there, like from just my perspective, from deep learning. So I forgot to mention this, like, so whenever I see implicit bias come up in the deep learning literature, it's always asking, okay, we have this architecture and it works super well. Why? What implicit bias does this encode? And so, for example, with convolutions, it's saying that like there's a certain kind of invariance to transposition. With attention, it's talking about like the conditional dependence between sequences of words, for example, or sequences of features. With I don't know, I can't think of any other ones off the top of my head, but it's usually like looking at like it's usually kind of trying to say like, here's an architecture. So we're going from the language of architecture to the language of like cognition, which is like what this architecture is allowing us to make some kind of bias. That's why it's some kind of implicit bias, which is why it works so well. And it's actually interesting to me because it, and I think we say the word implicit because in neural networks, they are implicit, right? They're just kind of implied by the architecture. Well, here we're actually being very explicit, right? We're saying like, there is some universal grammar on all human language. And so why is that useful? Because like if, for example, let's say at each level of these hierarchy here, does anybody know how to make a mouse show up when you're in play mode? I forget, there's a button. Control, option, no? Don't know. All right, so like, so if we start with utterance here, let's say like, let's just for the time being assume that the definition of syntactic structure, well, we've already seen that, it's like a parse, right? And then here, we don't really know what a syntactic category or rule is. We haven't formalized that yet, but like, let's assume we formalized it, right? If we started here and we just said like, all right, let's enumerate the full space of syntactic structures that could generate this utterance. It'd be a really, really big space, right? And then similarly, if we started here and said like, what's the full space of syntactic categories and rules that can generate these structures? It would be a really, really, really big space. And so what they're saying is like, all right, well, let's start here where we have some kind of high level concrete thing that we define, and well, if it's in the case of maybe language, it's we're kind of born with it. In the case of science or causality, we have to kind of construct it. And to Rose's point, it's going to be very subjective. But if we construct it or we have it, then that limits this space, and that limits this space, which limits this space. And so given this, inferring up this ladder becomes a lot more feasible because we've reduced the set of possible outcomes. Similarly, given if we want to learn a causal DAG from data, if we so like going up to this, if for example, in a pure kind of causal discovery standpoint, like we were talking earlier about structured learning. Well, if I want to learn a structure based on, say, conditional independence between these nodes, right? Well, if I say like, well, I'm only going to consider the space of DAGs where these nodes are only permitted to regulate these nodes, and these nodes are only permitted to regulate these nodes. Well, that narrows down the space quite a bit, right? Because anything like, so this wouldn't be allowed. This wouldn't, so like this kind of edge wouldn't be allowed. This kind of edge wouldn't be allowed. So once, every time I delete that possibility of edge, I've narrowed down the inference space a lot. If you remember from the course, like I shared that equation for, the combinatorial count of the number of DAGs consistent with a fixed set of variables. It's a big number, right? And so the bigger that space, the harder the inference task. So these kinds of abstractions allow us to make that inference more feasible.
Oh, it makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
I would like to see some concrete example.
I think I heard recently, like there's some word that all languages have. Like, I think it's like, oh yeah, the word is, huh? Like, I think I heard on the radio or something like that. Every single language in the world has, huh? So like, that's an example of that's a consistency across all languages, for example.
I think we have that in deep learning too with unknown tokens or in NLP, right? I don't understand what that concept is. The equivalent of huh, right? Like we use that all the time. We stick in an unknown token and then just like move on. And we categorize all of those similarly.
My colleague from Gamelon, Jeffrey's on the call. I was going to say, Jeffrey, we should do that for like unknown. We should just call it HUH and just have that be in our chat bot that we build. We could have that just be a response when we don't understand what people say. We just say, huh? What?
Let me jump in very briefly. Just to get back to it, to me, the universal grammar is really the structures within our brain and within our biochemistry that essentially can possibilities, and in the causal categories and laws, then that's the fundamental constraints in reality that essentially are driving these things. So as we move up the layers of the cake here, what you're really doing is you're gaining insights into the fundamental driving the grammar itself. And so the universal grammar to me is highly constrained by the machinery that actually unfold. And in the same sense, in terms of causality, it's actually the fundamental constraints of the machinery that we're trying to look at, which is the universe kind of thing, the reality. So really, to me, the universal grammar is constrained by how we think, literally. What's the UT stand for? Sorry, universal
Theory.
Theory is really just trying to characterize implicit information embedded within the environment itself.
Yeah.
So
anyway, those are the slides I managed to come up with on the time I had. I think there's probably a few elements of the paper that I was missing here. Let me see if I can.
Can we talk a second about the, you keep saying that with just a few examples, a kid can distinguish the difference between, for example, a cat and something else, and can build abstractions from that. I think we're underestimating how much exposure has gone into building the abstractions within the brain that make up the cat. And so when a kid initially is learning things like that, like a cat, or the kid might say like, I think dog is the first thing that a lot of them learn, right? And so they'll say like, oh, doggy. And then they might later point to a cat or some other animal and say doggy. And it's like, no, that's not a dog. That's a something else, right?
Yeah,
So
they make the errors and then they get corrected and they learn.
They get corrected as they go along. And exposure is really important, because if you don't have the exposure, then you've got the wrong abstraction, right? And so you're calling everything a dog when it isn't a dog, right? And one of the things with, I think, the human brain is that some of us at least focus on the things that are different. And I think babies in particular focus on the things that are different about this from something else. Whereas I think in deep learning, we kind of fall into focusing on the similarities between things, and it over constrains us, and it forces us to get the wrong abstractions, which is why sometimes coming out of deep learning, we get sort of things that as humans we look at and say, oh, that's so wrong.
Yeah.
Well, the one difference between deep learning and the human brain is the amount of data. Amazingly, human brain can just, like differentiate cats and dogs with very few data points, but deep learning requires a lot more. So
a lot more energy too.
Yeah, human brain is amazing.
I think that I guess my point is that we're underestimating the amount of exposure that's gone into building those abstractions already between.
So there's certainly, it's not like, so yeah, cat. I think I had a niece who came to our house and she saw our cat and she looks at the cat and she says, "It's a duck."
Yes.
And then it's like, well, that's not a duck, that's a cat. And she goes, "It's a cat." She's done. So, and then like the other cat came in the room. She's like, "That's a cat." And he's like, "All right, she's solved the learning problem. Just needed to, she had a duck prior. She updated it, and now she's learned a completely new category with two examples.
When we look at the vision, like the layers, and look at the lowest layers, when you look at those sort of components that make up, you've sort of seen those, I forget what the paper is, but where they've broken it down into like lines and circles and how things are constructed together. Like babies do that from the very moment they're born, right? They're constantly absorbing stuff and building various abstractions and layers of things, including colors and shapes and other things. So I think when we say that deep learning needs a ton of data, it's nothing compared to the amount of data that a person has already processed. And that it's really important to think about the exposure, both with people and with the deep learning algorithms, right? Making sure that there's a really wide variety of data.
Yeah. Deep learning is different. Deep learning is called narrow AI. Like one thing that, the deep learning community has been trying to do is, to come up with a more general AI, and they have this transfer learning thing going.
Mm-hmm.
but you just cannot compare with human brain. Human brain is very good at transferring what done before from a different domain to another new domain, and this save a lot of time in learning compared to neural net. And honestly, neural net has nothing similar to human brain. It's just at the highest concept, it looks similar, but after that, there's nothing like human brain. So it's still pretty narrow AI. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't think deep learning can be more generic.
Man, I think that the people in the deep learning, like, I mean, so just to kind of put all my cards on the table, so people who haven't chatted with me about this stuff before, like, I mean, I'm enthusiastic about deep learning, but to me, there's nothing particularly magical about it. It's just like universal mapping functions. Like, I just think of it as like really, really fancy splines, basically. And so, like, while there's, people like, for example, Yashua Bengio in his talk at the last NeurIPS was like, he thinks it's like the secret ingredient to all kind of higher level, he recognizes that, we need causality, we need to understand, kind of like how to reason across space and time, for example, but he thinks that like deep learning is the kind of connective tissue for all of that happening. And he's, the guy's got a Turing Award and I don't, so I'm not, I'm not really gonna just like say, I mean, I don't agree with that. I do, but to kind of channel what, if they were here in that conversation, what they would say is like, the reason, like saying a child can learn what the cat is from just a few examples is kind of, while deep learning can't, is kind of a straw man argument, because what the child is doing, is to Rose's point, is having already learned a bunch of they have a whole library of animal related abstractions that they can rely upon when trying to reason about what a cat is, while the deep learning is trying to do this from scratch. And that's not wrong. Rather, it's just like, okay, well, if that's true, then, how do we then we want to copy that, and we want to make these abstractions explicit and then be able to import them into new learning tasks so that we don't need to spend $10 million and 5 cubic tons of carbon to solve that new problem. But then there's also like, but the counter argument to there is like, actually there might be some, like if deep learning really just kind of learns very high dimensional conditional probability distributions. And we know from, for example, causal inference, that there are causal relationships that are just simply not identifiable, even with the highest dimensional probability distributions, because identifiability is a problem. And so, so like that's kind of why I like this body of literature when I think about natural language processing, because when deep learning is applied to natural language processing, it really just is really like, wow, we're gonna have very accurate conditional probability distributions between words and utterance, and a lot of people believe that like hidden somewhere in that conditional probability distribution is the abstractions on top of this hierarchy, right? Like it's somehow encoded in there somewhere, and this is why I like this paper, because it's like, well, so a lot of deep learning people are saying like, if I just have a lot of this stuff here, then I'm going to get some kind of representation that implicitly encodes this thing here. But I know from causal inference that you can give me all this stuff in the world, that this stuff is not identifiable from this stuff, and this stuff is not identifiable from this stuff. I can perform I can get a good, maybe a distribution on it, but if I try to reason causally about what's happening up here and how it would affect new events, I'm going to make errors. And that mode of thinking seems to be completely missing from the culture of deep learning. I'm not saying.
So to characterize that slightly differently, you're suggesting that if you could generate a system that could generate, sorry, could you go back to the,
Yeah.
Sorry, very briefly. So you're suggesting through, and the whole point of doing the causal inference stuff is if we can have a universal theory that can generate the events accurately, if we can generate downward a more fruitful pathway than trying to go back upwards, right? Is that we can essentially hypothesize different universal theory, we can use data and as reality, then we can universal theory.
Yeah, so like it's an inference problem. So if, for example, given an event, right? And I only say, let's say the system has, what I observe has 3 nodes, right? 3 random variables. And there's a whole bunch of latent random variables that may or may not be in the system. And let's suppose let's say I put no constraint on the amount of latent variables that are in this system. Then there's an infinite number of causal Bayesian networks that could have caused those things. And similarly, whatever grammar generates causal Bayesian networks, there'd be, you know, a super infinite number of those.
So it explodes as you travel up. So we can't travel up because it's just a problem. That we can travel down, or at least deprecate between traveling up a little bit and down a lot, and try and generate universal theories that can reproduce the events. Or am I misunderstanding you?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think like, all right, if I say like, well, only a certain, you know, I'm going to say, maybe I'll limit the number of variables, or maybe I don't limit, but I limit the categories of variables, and I maybe I put higher probability on simpler explanations, so simpler dags as opposed to more complex dags, etc. So if I put a whole bunch of constraints on the system, then doing inference going up here becomes feasible. And I think the analogy to linguistics is that that's how we understand and learn language.
I think the problem is that we run the risk of only ever discovering what we already believe is true.
Exactly.
Or
exactly the problem.
We're inclined to believe it's true.
I think I'd go further, because if we form our syntactical categories or causal categories, we're doing that by what we already believe is true. Right? And every time we constrain, we stop ourselves from seeing other possibilities. I think that's the difference between maybe a human and a machine, that an aware human will at least say, I don't understand that. That's unknown to me. Tell me more. I need to expand my abstractions. Whereas a machine doesn't do that.
I'm going to just geek out a little bit for a moment. Has anybody seen this film?
It came to mind several times in your talk. Yes.
I mean, I think this is our saving grace, which is like, we have our implicit biases and our inferences are going to be constrained. So like there could be some kind of ground truth that's wrong, that we're missing because our implicit biases are moving us away from them, given the data. But our saving grace is that if we could get dramatically different data than the data that we've already seen, then it would, you know, it could essentially kind of you get to a point where like, okay, either this highly unlikely explanation is the explanation for what I'm seeing, or I need to kind of refactor my biases. And, you know, to some extent that may or may not, you know, if it come, maybe, you know, I'm not sure what Chomsky felt when he saw this movie. Maybe he felt as though like, yeah, I don't see us understanding squiggly circles anytime soon, because that's just not part of our universal grammar doesn't admit it. I like to believe that, like, you know, what I love about this movie is like just imagining like, all right, if you saw a truly extraterrestrial language and you worked on it hard enough, you know, could you in fact change your, you know, kind of update your universal grammar and perhaps you know, by literally kind of thinking of it in terms of the probability distribution, literally kind of changing the support of that distribution, and then you know, in so doing, completely change the way you perceive the world.
I think he argues that we're biologically bounded,
Yeah.
and he uses the example of rats and prime number mazes. They just can't figure it out. There's something in their biology that just does not allow them to work it out. And so it's sort of, I think, not accepting that we have intellectual bounds too it's a dangerous path to go down, right?
Or it is an uncomfortable one. I mean, I think there is some theory, like, or some science fiction writer who's, you know, kind of poses, there's another one, there's a science fiction film where they go out and they see some giant kind of orb in outer space, and it starts like, you know, all of a sudden, like, dead people start coming back to life. Like, if the dead people from people's past start coming back to life. Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
No.
Stalker?
What is it?
Is it Stalker?
Say it one more time.
Stalker?
So
Put it in the chat.
Stalker, I mean the Tarkovsky movie. Solaris, yes. Sorry. Yeah.
With Clooney, I think that's the more recent one.
Morris.
So in this film, yeah, here's the image. So they go out in outer space and they encounter this giant, like, orb, and it's demonstrating intelligent behavior. It causes his, you know, and basically the orb starts to, like, scanning the brains of the humans on the spaceship, and this is his dead wife, and she basically magically comes back to life, and because the orb is somehow picking up his memories of her and making them real. But the reason it's just like this, you know, this dramatic kind of interaction with this entity that, like, they are just incapable of understanding one another. So, like, the thing is interacting with them and it's trying to communicate with them, and they're trying to communicate with it, and it doesn't work because there's just no common grounds for communication, not even at a very, very high level. So you know, so like in that film, like what is it? You know, when Close Encounters of the First Kind. Is that what it's called?
Third kind.
Third Kind. I can't remember. When they you know, they're able to use music or prime numbers or whatever to kind of establish a common grammar with the aliens, which implies, like, okay, there's some kind of common universal grammar, universal theory, or something like that. While in this film, like, there isn't a common universal grammar, or universal theory, so there is no basis of doing communication.
Might want to be a little bit careful to equate universal theory or the framework theory to universal grammar. Universal grammar might be embedded within human physiology,
Yeah,
but that doesn't necessarily mean universal theory is necessarily embedded.
this is
Yeah, so
this
I think
is supposed to be innate.
universal theory is not necessarily innate.
That's true.
At least in the description that you
like, I think it's not. Yeah.
it seemed like
Or maybe it is. I mean, at the end, causality, it might be something that it's already in our brains. I mean, it's a way of reasoning, but it might not exist in the real world. It's just something that helps us to understand it better.
yeah, but you can have framework theories in different fields that potentially might be conflicting. So the framework theory in biology and the framework theory in physics might be completely different.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that it's okay. Maybe a higher level theory defines those It splits like those theories are two different kinds. Well,
my point is that the framework theory can be is not universal in the sense that it's always the same. You can change the framework theory if you see the world is changing somehow. It's just a different level of abstraction of this.
Or there's another theory. It's highly related to relevance. You can look up something called relevance realization, which is a process that comes from the philosophy and the Cogsci, which is a very different way of understanding this, to say that different aspects of the universal theory have relevance in specific situations, whereas other aspects of the universal theory do not have any relevance in this situation. And so we have to draw a subset of the universal theory together in our minds based on what is relevant to us in order to have it answer questions. I'm just saying there is a very different framing of this from a different discipline yet again. So it's a very complex topic.
David, could you give us a reference for that?
I'll do my best.
Thank you. Did we lose Robert?
Yeah, I think he lost his connection.
I think we did. Anyway, that was a wonderful discussion, everyone. I really, really enjoyed that, and I hope I can discuss more around this. It's fascinating.
Sorry about this, guys. I got kicked off the router for a while. I lost the last 2 minutes. Something was
just commenting that there is in the philosophy and in the 4E Cogsci, there is the concept of what's called relevance realization, and relevance realization is a human process of filtering theory by relevance, so that when we go to apply the universal theory in a given context, we assign relevant different parts of that universal theory that have meaning in this situation, and then we just ignore the rest. But in a situation we might have the same universal theory, but different parts of it become relevant. So rather than it being separate models or distinct models or separate ontologies with these hard lines between them, the idea is it's very probabilistic, kind of manifold, and then we draw out of that manifold what is relevant to us in this situation from the universal theory, and we apply that in order to make decisions in the real world in real time.
What is that framework called? What did you call it?
Relevance realization. I'll do some research on it. It's from a philosopher by the name of John Vervaeke. It's psychologist.
So
anyway, it's a very, very different trajectory to this conversation. Somewhat inaccessible. But.
So is universal theory a human-defined construct, or are we trying to say that it exists even outside of human perception?
I think it's a human-defined thing.
Human-defined, okay.
Well,
that's the way I perceive
it's defined by reality. So the ultimate is reality itself, and then humans interpret that relevant to humans, if that makes sense. So there's bits of the universe that are relevant to us, where we're sitting, and there's bits that aren't, like which are 200 million light.
Oh. So here's what they say in the paper. Can you hear me? Or am I getting kicked off again?
No, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. All right. First, let me just share my screen. Or maybe I shouldn't. Yeah, I'm not going to share my screen in case I'm having connection issues. First, as a grammar of a language, crucial constraints on causal domain theories may come from knowledge at higher levels of abstraction. Some aspects of a causal grammar may be conditioned by a truly basic and innate foundation, a universal theory, or UT by analogy to UG in linguistics. But other constraints are likely to come from levels of framework-like knowledge in between the innate foundation and the frontiers of domain theories where learning typically occurs. Yeah, so he's saying that maybe it isn't innate, or at least our ability to, so I mean, again, he's not talking about the nature, he's not talking about metaphysics, right? He's not talking about ground truth, nature. He's talking about the specific frameworks and the specific theories and the framework theories that we use to kind of create causal models of the world. And so in other words, he's not talking about nature, he's talking about how we make inferences about causality in nature. So this is not to say, so he does suggest that it's possibly innate, and this reminds me of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is to say that like, if you had like a sound and complete system for reasoning, that there are true things that cannot be proven by that system. So if we might have a universe, we might have an innate universal theory analogous to this universal grammar. And that is not to say that there are true things about the universe that all true things about this universe could be captured by this grammar or this theory but rather things that we're capable of understanding we're only able to understand them by having some kind of constraint on in the form of this universal theory that's innate. I think I've just stunned you all into silence.
No, we're all thinking.
Mind's blown.
It's reminding me of that. Remember the day Bill was talking about, like, in engineering, you're always trying to keep it in the linear. And they can do that in engineering because they're creating the thing and they can put specifications around it. Whereas a lot of the time we're trying to describe nature and we don't do a good job maybe of defining the bounds, and it goes into the nonlinear and we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, it reminds me, like in causal inference, there's this theory, so before we kind of formalize things as kind of counterfactual reasoning, there's this idea of the intervention, which is like, A and B move together, but A causes B if I do something to A, and B is affected, but if I do something to B, A is not affected. And so what you've done there is, it's a very nice and useful definition of causality. But what you've kind of painted yourself into a corner, because it's now you're saying that the definition of cause and effect depends on an agent's ability to intervene in the system, or at least theoretically intervene in the system, which is to say, like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, did it make a sound kind of thing? Like you're defining sound only in terms of how it's processed by the ear. Here you're defining causality only in terms of our ability to intervene on causes and observe consequences. If you remove humans from the equation, does causality exist? Well, I mean, it seems like it should, and that's a problem with our ability to kind of understand cause and effects, that we can't. It's human centric. Cool. Well, let's see here. What's the name of the follow-up paper? That's probably what we got to just do next time. So I didn't cover these summary points. So viewing intuitive theories in terms of hierarchy of increasing abstract knowledge representations has led us to formulate problems of causal inference on 3 interlocking levels: inferring causes and predicting effects. So this is infer hidden causes of an observed event, predict its unobserved effects. Inferring causal network, so this is coming up with a structure, this is structured learning. And inferring causal principles, so inferring the principles that organize a set of observed causal systems. systems. And so this to me is interesting because, so this third level here, again, I know for a fact from formal causal inference theory, again, all the stuff that was done by Pearl, functional structural causal, that you can't do this with data alone, right? I cannot infer if a structural causal model or a functional causal model from, even if you gave me the data and you gave me the DAG, I would not be able to get a structural causal model from that, from pure statistical inference. I would need some kind of information beyond statistical relationships, basically implicit biases for what kinds of things could generate this system. So, and that might be, say, you know, okay, we're in biology, so I'm going to assume enzyme kinetics. So like, oh, okay, I'm going to assume kind of Occam's razor holds here, and that's simpler is better than more complex, or yeah, things like that. And so like, it seems to me like that's kind of what we're getting at here. Like we can't, particularly here, going from here to here, like inferring a causal network structure when there's when there's unobserved variables, and there could be an arbitrary amount of unobserved variables, that can get pretty hairy, obviously. But like going from here to here.
Robert, you're not sharing your screen anymore.
Oh my God, sorry. Share screen. All right, so yeah, sorry, here was the summary here. So inferring causes from predicting effects, inferring causal networks, and inferring causal principles. So this is the inference task in causal reasoning that he formalizes given that hierarchy. So starting from the bottom level, going to the second level, we're inferring causes and predicting effects. Infer the hidden causes of an observed event, predict its unobserved effects given a theory at the most specific level. Inferring causal networks, so this is structure learning. And then inferring causal principles. So for me, this is going from kind of given a causal network and given some data, trying to infer the mechanisms underlying causality there. So, you know, the one formalization we have of that is a structural causal model. And we know from that formal branch of theory that we cannot infer a structural causal model from a causal network and data itself. Like something has to be, the human has to add domain knowledge there for that to happen. And so, of course, now any kind of conclusions that we make based on this, if we come up with that model, then any kind of conclusions we make based on that system will be constrained by our assumptions about the mechanisms underpinning that system. Interesting. Like this is really, you know, I love analogizing. I love learning things and then connecting them to something in a disparate field. Like, I like this paper because, I mean, you know, I work at Gamma, I work with computational linguistics all the time, and I get inklings, I get kind of intuitions for like how causality could be brought into play here, but you know, nothing has formalized it like this, like just, you know, kind of Chomsky style linguistics and you know, things like causal inferences and causal structure learning and this high level causal principles, which to me kind of like, I bring in causal principles to like, and so with the workshop, I was talking about altitude and temperature. Okay, that's Newtonian physics. And with that graph that I showed earlier, that's about biology, that's, you know, signal transduction pathways. You know, with the disease and symptoms, and you know, that's kind of an ontology that comes from Western medicine. And so like, anyway, I think this is cool. There's I think so. One thing we could do next time, and there's a follow-up paper. Jeremy, are you on the line? Do you remember what it's called?
Jeremy left. I think it's the two, is it two grammars? Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, two grammars.
Yeah, he posted it in Slack already, so
Okay.
we can look it up in the Slack channel.
Cool. All right. So then we have a paper for next time. Is anybody
You know,
want about?
I think Bernard said he was going to present next week. He said he couldn't be here today. Do other people remember that? I thought he said he was going to do something next week.
I'll confirm with him. Not a big deal. So we'll just.
No, he just said that he was looking forward to the recording.
Okay. So all right. So either Bernard will confirm for next week, or if he's not, does somebody want to kind of volunteer to do the two causal grammar paper? Or I can continue, I suppose.
I haven't read it, so but if I feel comfortable with it, I'll let you know. Maybe I can have a go.
Yeah, this is basically, you can already see here directly just, so here's the same graph as before. It's a bunch of, it just looks like we're just trying to, so we have some classes on nodes of behavior, disease, symptoms. We have a generative model based on that. So we're going to assume a power law for, I guess, some kind of exogenous variable. And then, so we're just kind of formalizing some of the stuff that we've been talking about intuitively here. And again, like there's no grade here. So if you're reading stuff here and you're like, I have no idea what this means, this is complete gibberish to me, then great. Then like let's talk about what are the boundaries of understanding there, and then let's kind of suss it out in the call. So I don't think, so I think the calls where we don't understand what's going on are even more interesting. Sound good? See you guys next week.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Yes.